Hey, what's up everyone? How you doing? Let's finish off this bingo chart today before we're, forgetting about it, because it's been a while since I made one of these. But we have one row left of dubious Fire Emblem Three Houses takes that I want to go over, discuss. Is there some truth to them? Is there some nuance to them? Or is it just completely something I disagree with? So that's what we're doing, and let's see if we can get a bingo. We can get a column here. And we could technically get a row here if we really disagree with all these, and that's really all we can do. We can't really get a full chart, unfortunately. So let's see. Swords are one of the best weapon types on Maddening. Now we kind of went over this in Axes Are Bad Overall, so I don't have a whole lot to say here that's new. It's different here because this one was mostly focused on axes against everything else, whereas this one's more about swords against everything else. I guess it's also a little related to the one about the Wodao Plus being one of the best weapons in the game. That one I got in yellow because I was like, it really depends on how broadly you define as one of the best. Does it mean it's in the top 5, top 10, top 30? Is it good, but it's just a bunch of other better weapons, basically? But this one I think I might color red. But let me go over it a little bit just to make sure I agree with what I just said. The best weapon types, for me, that means swords, lances, bows, axes, and then everything else that exists in this game, so like gauntlets, tomes, staves, I guess, if you're a fan of thegamer.net or whatever that website was that made recover one of the best weapons, like faith magic, reason magic, etc. Among those, how good are swords really? Well, I think axes are better for sure, as I went over before. The rough summary of that would be, if you missed that episode, Axe Fair is on a better class than Sword Fair, because Wyvern, regardless of like how much Wyvern spend the meta is, Wyvern is a better class than like Swordmaster and Assassin and Enlightened One. So for that reason, units in our optimal class are better off using axes a lot of the time than using swords. That's just a thing. In addition, there are some really good axes in this game that swords can't really match. There are some okay swords too. Like I said, the Wodao is not bad. It's just not the best weapon in the game, but it's pretty good. But axes have like A-Meter and Brave Axe Plus and a lot of other things that are pretty good. The Mace, for example, is not a really cool axe. Lances have Swordbreaker, enemy lance users like Pegasus Knights, which can be pretty annoying, whereas enemies that have Axebreaker are less common and also less annoying. The hit gap between swords and axes looks pretty big on paper, but because Axe Prowess gives more hits than Sword Prowess does, that hit gap is smaller. So generally you can make axes work better than swords. So that's why I think axes are better than swords. Lances, I think, is a bit closer. I would still give the edges to lances overall, for somewhat similar reasons. I don't think lances are actually themselves super great. There's a lot of like relic lances and legendary lances and like I forgot what they're called. Basically the crest stone lances, I guess I'll call them. So you got like Lance of Ruin and you got the Lewin. Those are okay. You don't really want to spam them because their properties aren't that great besides the might. Particularly the Lance of Ruin, I remember it being very heavy and very inaccurate. So I don't think they're that great. And generally when you're using lances, you probably want to combine it with a combat art, and that's what makes them good. If you look at like Ferdinand, for example, if he's attacking something with a lance, he's not really doing it because he wants to use lances. In fact, his best class is Wyvern, so he'd probably rather use axes on enemy phase, or if he didn't have Swift Strikes, or before he gets Swift Strikes. But I guess he wants to use lances to build his lance rank for Swift Strikes. But if he had like a brave combat art for axes, I think he'd rather use that, for example. But he's stuck with lances, and so he uses those. And so he used like Swift Strikes with the Lance of Ruin for massive damage, which works, but I think it's more down to Swift Strikes than because of lances. That's basically what I want to say. And there's more units like that. You have like the big 3 Swift Strike users, Ferdinand, Sylvain, and Sedet. They all have that same dynamic going on that I just described. And then who else really wants to use lances? I can't really think of anyone. There's people who insist that someone like Ingrid, for example, wants to use lances and swords because it suits Falcon Knight better. But she's still better off just using axes. Even if she's a Falcon Knight, I think it would probably... Well, it depends on Lance Fair and Sword Fair. I forgot how big the gap is exactly. But I know Ingrid probably just wants to go Wyvern and use axes anyway. So yeah, lances and axes, I think they edge out. So that would put swords at top 3 at best. Bows... I mean, if you're using like Retribution, I don't think bows are much better than other weapons. In fact, you could argue they get worse. The main thing I like about bows, somewhat ironic looking at other games, but the main thing I like about bows is you can get 1-2 range pretty easily without losing a lot of other advantages that you would get, because, you know, javelins and hand axes kind of suck compared to just using a bow and having close counter. And then bows also have usually associated with like curved shot and other range increasing options like range +1 on Archer. So they're more flexible range-wise, and that kind of goes away with Retribution. But before you have Retribution, and even if you have it afterwards, it can be nice to have the bow's range. And then it's also nice with bows that generally enemies don't have bow break as far as I recall, so your accuracy never gets dropped super low. The big thing that's like funny about bows is that someone pointed this out in a comment section earlier. If you're countering long-range tomes using Retribution, for example Hubert in part 2, if you're using a bow, you get a massive hit penalty because bows have a hit penalty the further away you shoot them, even if it's through Retribution. And so you're actually better off switching to like a sword or something. I remember the speed round, for example, against Hubert, they will use Retribution on I think Byleth, and she will equip a sword from I think it's Cloud, but it doesn't really matter. I think there's multiple routes that employ this strategy. He actually equips like an iron sword just to counter Hubert with more accuracy because he fires from like 10 range away. So you don't want to use a bow and take a massive penalty. So depends on the situation, but generally I would say bows are better than swords. There's like situations where swords are good even in the early game. One example that I can come up with at the top of my head is a very fast character like Petra. In the early game can actually double attack enemies using a sword, but if she uses something heavier, she'll weigh herself down. But I feel like those situations are more rare than when you want to use the other weapon types. And then tomes, I actually think this one is more competitive, tomes versus swords, because tomes aren't very good, which I guess says a lot about swords as a weapon type. Because I think early on chip magic is nice. The big limiter is of course how many times you can use a spell early on before your spell breaks and becomes unusable. But every one of them uses is good. And if you put like the same restriction on a sword, for example, you almost wouldn't use a sword as many times either because single characters just don't attack as much on Maddening per map. You could probably get away with a limit. Of course, swords have like combat art, so they go through uses faster. So it's a really tough comparison to make. But my point is, you might attack as many times with a sword with Petra as you will attack with a tome on Dorothea, depending on like which chapter we're talking about, of course. But the limit early in the game is annoying. And later on, I'm sure you're all familiar with using tome users, using magic users later in 3 houses. They generally don't double, so unless they're one-shotting like Lasithia or Constance, they're not super useful. Most characters at that point have been built in a way that lets them one-round KO, either on player phase or enemy phase. Generally player phase, through like multi-hit combat arts, you know, Hunter's Volley, Swift Strikes, or just Brave X plus something, or using the Amir, or using Battalion Wrath, something like that to let them one-shot enemies. And in those cases, chip damage isn't very relevant, and neither are the debuff effects on tomes. So I don't think magic is generally very good on Maddening. It doesn't help that you can run out either, but that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is generally, you know, the fact that they don't one round, in addition to all the other limiting factors on the magic users, like the fact that they are not very durable, the fact that they don't have a lot of move unless they're like Dark Flyer, which comes with its own little problems, such as being DLC. So overall, I would say swords are probably better than magic on Maddening, so it's got that one beat. Gauntlets, I don't have too much experience using gauntlets on Maddening. I generally just, I use gauntlets early on Felix and Byleth to get more activation rates on their crests, and generally sometimes they just do more damage with that because their damage output is so good. So attacking twice is more important than having high might on a weapon. For example, with Felix it stacks with his personal, which we'll get into in a minute. So in that way, I think gauntlets are nice sometimes. I have never actually used a War Master or a Grappler long term, so I couldn't tell you how great they are from personal experience, but I know other people have praised them in the past for being really good. I'm just going to take their word for it because they're generally well known as like War Master and Grappler are pretty good classes overall. You probably don't want to use gauntlets on enemy phase too much, but you can probably switch someone to an axe if that's more advantageous. And on player phase, I think gauntlets, provided they're backed with like high crit rate and fist fair, I think should probably be considered better than swords overall, at least even. So we have gauntlets probably beating them, and that along with all the other physical weapon types and just magic slightly beating out. So looking at it this way, I don't think swords are one of the best weapon types on Maddening. I think you could argue they're the worst, if not the second worst behind magic if you count those. A lot of people don't even consider magic a weapon because usually make a distinction between weapons and then magic, or weapons and then tomes. So in that way, swords would be the worst weapon type. So this is one that's going to be red. If we're going for a full column, which I guess we are now, we have a bingo right here. But let's see what else we got here. We might be able to get two. Might be able to get a column and a row. Felix should never get a battalion. I was heavily in favor of this when I first played 3 houses because I looked at battalions, I saw they gave like 1, 2, maybe 3 attack at the max, and that's it. And looked at Felix personal and I was like, yo, +5, that's much better. I'm never giving him a battalion ever. I even recruited Felix on my first playthrough. I played on Golden Deer, but I recruited Felix because he seemed really good. Because of that skill, partially. I thought that skill was really good. And turns out that there's battalions that give more than just 5 attack. And honestly, even if a battalion gives like 3 or 4 attack, but they give a bunch of everything else and hit, avoid, crit avoid, whatever, you could still argue that's better than +5 attack. Not always. There are situations where you don't want Felix to have a battalion. Particularly the early game when you're limited on battalions, and even when you're not limited, there's an argument to be made that you should have a battalion on Felix. Or not, either way. But it depends. But the phrase should never get a battalion, I think, screams dark red to me, because there's a point in the game where you want to have a battalion. The trouble with Felix, of course, is that he has a Bane in authority, so he can't get the really good battalions until much later on, and with more investment in his authority, which comes at the cost of either his other weapon uses, his other skill masteries, or someone else's skill masteries, depending on how you go about boosting it and how you distribute your tutor rank. So there is a cost to getting Felix to a higher authority compared to other characters. And this is a problem he shares with, for example, Hilda, and it's a contrary to what some other characters have in an authority boon, like Ignatz, the Lords, Byleth, etc. So it's definitely a disadvantage, but generally he's still better off having a battalion than not having one. Like something like the Geralt Mercenaries, even a simple one like that, is really good. Now, Geralt Mercenaries is in fairly high demand because, of course, it's a really good battalion in general, and especially if you have someone else with low authority, like Hilda, she might want it at some points. Especially because Hilda actually has a good charm, so you can make better use of the Gambit on a Geralt Mercenaries, the good old assault troop. Felix's charm is kind of bad, so he generally just doesn't hit his Gambits if he has one anyway. I think it's still good for him to have a battalion. It lets him build more authority rank over the game. I don't think this is a huge impact because the experience, the weapon rank experience you get from actually having a battalion in battle for authority is not very big per combat. It depends on how you play, of course. If you're playing an efficient playthrough where you're not killing everything on the map, where you're skipping chapters, then that amount is like 1, 2, 3 rounds of combat per chapter probably, depending on which chapter we're talking about, of course. Some of them might go on longer, like a route map. But if you're actually routing every map, for example, if you like to play that way, then you're going to see a lot more build-up, a lot more effect from the authority as he trains in battle. It's a small benefit, but it might save you a couple tutoring sessions somewhere along the line to get to a certain threshold. Speaking of thresholds, I would say you want to hit like D and C authority with Felix, and then from there, you probably have other units that have hit B or A authority at the point where they no longer really demand the lower rank battalions that are still really good, like Geralt Mercenaries. Another really good battalion, for example, that you could consider getting the Felix to is like the C rank battalions that the Lords come with after time skip, depending on what you're doing. I know, for example, that the Ashes and Dust one is really good on Hilda, so she can get to C authority by time skip. That's really nice, because then you can give her Claude's battalion, and then give Claude something else that he can use with his A authority, like the Keyhole Wyvern Company. So that's the way I like to distribute my battalions between people with good authority and bad authority. But yeah, Felix should have a battalion most of the time once you have one. But early game, it's really nice not to give him one. The +5 attack is huge in chapter 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. Around chapter 5, I would probably give him a battalion. But he and Catherine, sometimes it's nice to take advantage. They can use it really well with Gauntlets, for example. Hitting twice with +5 attack is a huge damage increase. You can actually one-round KO in the early game sometimes. It's really stupid. And sometimes you can just kill enemies without taking a counterattack as well. I remember the Blue Lions LTC. Other than the early game, they didn't give Felix a battalion for the turtle fight. They just let him do +5 damage with his actual attacks. I was really surprised to see it that late in the game actually be useful, but there are situations where it's nice. Generally, though, at some point in your playthrough, you should give him a battalion. He doesn't have to keep it on him all the way through, but he should get a battalion at some points. And if you don't give him one, you're doing yourself a disservice. He might lose some attacks some of the way, but overall it's worth it. Vengeance is a bad gimmick, and one of my favorite bad takes of Three Houses. Yes, this is a bad one. Vengeance is good, and it's really overpowered. I think the way most people play Maddening is they bunch up their characters and walk through the map with like a giant, the giant ball of death. That's the only way to beat Maddening without really extensive planning, I find. Like early on, chapter 2, 3, 4, etc. Just keep your units together and kill enemies. In that playstyle, there is no excuse for not using Vengeance as much as you can, especially with Bernadetta, who is really good with it. You might say, oh shit, well, I might get one-on kill with Bernadetta. Find an enemy that doesn't one-on kill her. It's not that difficult. Some enemies don't double her, some enemies don't Oko her, and some enemies don't do either of them, and so you can set up Vengeance. You don't have to be at 1 HP for Vengeance to be good. You don't have to be hitting for exactly 19 damage if you have 20 HP, for example. Just a bit of damage is good. It activates her personal, and then Vengeance, even if you took like 10 damage, it adds 10 damage, plus I think like 1 or 2 that Vengeance already has by itself, plus her personal. That's enough damage to kill in one hit, and if not, someone else can set it up because, again, the way you're playing is probably Ball of Death. If you're not doing Ball of Death strategies, you might be bust, kill skipping, in which case Vengeance. It's a little gimmicky because there's probably people who can one-run the boss with, like, if you're warp skipping, if you're giving someone like Stride, Warp, etc. to get into the boss, turn 1 the map. Vengeance probably not the easiest way to kill a boss, but it's often still doable just because you're probably attacking something, getting damage, and then if you have Blessing, you can attack anything and survive, because Blessing will always let you live with 1 HP. So in that case, there's usually a way to get Bernie to boss kill anyway with Vengeance, which is funny, but not necessary. I don't think she's a great boss kill with Vengeance, but you can do it. And then the amount of power that Bernie has with Vengeance surpasses even the power of someone like Dimitri or Edelgard or Byleth. She's just so powerful with it. She can one-shot enemies you couldn't even imagine. She can miss sometimes, but I actually find that Vengeance is so overkill that you use like a Training Lance Plus and still get Okos a lot of the time. And in those cases, the accuracy is generally reliable, and you can usually make it like the upper 90s with something like a linked attack, just a support bonus somewhere, or someone like Caspar standing nearby or something. That's probably possible as well. And in those cases, Vengeance just gets the kill reliably, better than all your other units. And if you're fighting enemies like 3 or 4 at a time, there should never be a situation where Bernie is in danger because she's using Vengeance on someone. It probably makes your life easier rather than makes it harder. Now, I found that as the game goes on, you do need more care with Bernie to survive while using Vengeance, because the enemy density is higher and there's more long-range threats that can take her out. Gambits can be bad news as well. You can still turn Bernie into an enemy phase attacker using like Vantage with Battalion Wrath, but those setups are a bit more complicated. I don't blame anyone for not taking advantage of Vantage later in the game. There's probably better enemy phase builds, and there's probably better ways to play the game. But if you're taking on enemies piece by piece, at any point in the game, Vengeance is really, really good. It also works with Cyril and Dudu. I mentioned Bernie because her power early on is really good. She can get it by chapter 4. So can Dudu, depending on what you focus him on, of course. I have the most experience with Bernie, that's why I talk from her perspective, and because I made the Bernie waifu, did a lot of research for it. But Cyril and Dudu can make use of it pretty well as well. A lot of people bring up that they don't have a crest, so it's easier for them to get to low HP. I never found it hard to get Bernie to low HP. You just don't use a relic for it. You don't use one of the relic weapons for it. You use something else, and generally that's an enemy that doesn't kill her, like a Poison Strike Archer. Those do massive damage to her, but Poison Strike will never kill, so she always gets about 1 HP or something. Really useful. So yeah, Vengeance is good. If you're playing on lower difficulties, I want to mention this because I sometimes forget that not everyone plays Maddening, I guess. If you're playing on lower difficulties, I think Vengeance is still fun, and everyone should do it. I don't know if I'd call it a gimmick because it's still one of the most powerful options you have in your army, but you need it less to 1 round, and so its relative value compared to other units decreases. Like on hard mode, you often don't even need something like Swift Strikes or Hunter's Volley to 100 KO. You can just double attack and win. Even if you don't have like Darting Blow, you can probably double and 100 KO on hard mode. So in those cases, yeah, you need Vengeance a little bit less badly. I still recommend it for every player for fun reasons. It's just less good relatively. It's very powerful still, and you can probably still find ways to make it useful, but it stands out a bit less. I would still say it's one of the better combat arts in the game, even on hard mode. But the difference between the power that Vengeance has is a bit overkill, and the setup you need is probably mostly unnecessary on hard mode. It's been a while since I finished hard mode, but you probably don't need it. But it doesn't mean it's a bad gimmick, I think. It's a bit gimmicky, but on Maddening, it's one of the best combat arts you have, and you should always use it if you have it and you don't necessarily want to avoid it. Like, if you're not making Bernie use Vengeance, you are not using her optimally. That doesn't mean you can't, that doesn't mean you should always use it if you don't like it. It just means you're shooting yourself in the foot, and if you're okay with that, then by all means do it. Mortal Savant is a useful class. This was a highly contested take back in the day when the game was new, because Mortal Savant, when you're looking at the game on paper, it can look either very good or very bad to you, depending on what you're kind of looking for. I need to check its skills real quick, because I'm actually not 100% sure exactly what it has. I'm pretty sure it has Swordfare and Tomefair. Yeah, it does. Okay, that's one of the reasons why it was being contested, because people were like, well, Cynthia should be a Mortal Savant because her combat art, her hidden talent is swords, so she can be has a sword boon. That way, if you just tutor her in that, and then it maxes perfectly with her, you know, her talent for reason as well, it's a perfect class for her. But then it also reduces your speed growth compared to others, which is like, it's not really that relevant at that point. Like, you're level 30, you're a master class already, you don't really need speed level ups at that point anymore, and Cynthia was never really about doubling. And there's other characters that were kind of being argued about as well, like Manuela, for example. She has a reason boon, so it's a bit weird to try and turn her into the Mortal Savant. She needs like, yeah, you need A swords, B plus reason to get 100%. So let's say you need B plus swords and B reason instead. That's a bit more reasonable. That's a lot of work on someone like Manuela. At the core though, like, Mortal Savant is already behind a couple points just because it's a magical class. And at that point, like I discussed earlier, the magic classes just aren't that great on Maddening. They can be useful at times, but they're never really your best option overall. Like, your MVP is rarely going to be a magic user. It can happen, but with all the limitations they have in durability, tome use, and everything, it's hard to really say that these classes are good overall. This one is not really about comparisons though, it's just about is it useful or not, which is a very vague term when you think about it, because every unit and every class can be useful at some point in the game. Even if they're not optimal, they can be useful. If they kill one enemy, like, are they useful on a map? If they kill one enemy out of the 10 you're killing, are they useful? I guess that's questionable. But I think compared to the alternatives, it's not often going to be the best option. I think for most magic users, either something like Bishop, Gramarye, Dark Knight, not Holy Knight, I would say Mortal Savant is probably on par with or better than Holy Knight at the very least. But those three, I think for most magic units in the game are better. Dark Flyer, I would say, is better as well. Valkyrie, I don't really know enough about to make a judgment call on, but it could be more useful at times, I guess. Generally, I would say there's always a better option for a magic unit than Mortal Savants. The speed growth is not really a big deal. I just don't really care for Sword Fair at that point. It can be, like, if you're doing Lysithea with, like, a lot of focuses on swords, and you're trying to get an Oko with, I think it's called Soul Blade, then I can see Mortal Savant being okay, but it's never been my favorite option. I don't really have the numbers to back up this. This is just a lack of experience in that class, but I generally think she's better off with the other classes. I would rather go Dark Knight, personally. I wouldn't call this very useful, but, you know, I'm going to make it orange because I don't agree with it. I don't disagree with it as much as I disagree with the red one, so I guess we're not getting another bingo here in that case, if we're going for full reds. Of course, in a way, I've been disagreeing with every take so far, so in a way, maybe we're getting bingo just off not agreeing with everything. Okay, that's Mortal Savant for you. And then finally, we have Sword of Void is better than Dancer, which, I mean, you already know I disagree with that one. You already know you should not ditch your Dancer for Sword of Void +1. Or Sword of Void +20. Sword of Void +1 would be really bad as well. So, you can use both. I think I should point it out. You can both have a Dancer that has Sword of Void +20 and have him fight. But Dancer doesn't have the best combat modifications. It's never really a good combat class. So that's why I'm not a fan of having this half and half approach of having a Dancer, but then also training them in combat. I think that's a waste of experience. I think you should focus on less units in that case. Take advantage of the fact that using a Dancer means someone doesn't need experience in anything, and give more experience and class experience and everything else to your other units. Why make a unit that's not going to be the best they can possibly be at fighting, good at fighting? Emergencies sometimes are brought up in this case, like, I want my Dancer to be able to fight if they have to, but if it's about killing an extra enemy, just have them dance for someone else and they can kill that enemy. If it's about getting overwhelmed on enemy phase, I think you're better off improving your positioning in a way that doesn't put your Dancer in harm's way than you are of trying to make your Dancer sort of good at combat, because they're never going to be great. Like, even if you give them experience every once in a while, for someone to be good at combat, even in, like, hard mode, they need upkeep, you know? You can't just train someone to be level 10 and be like, okay, they're going to be good for the rest of the game now because I did that. It's like, no, they're going to fall off in combat at some points, as if you don't feed them XP full time. The XP curve in this game is a bit more demanding than just a kill every map, right? They need more combat experience to be good at fighting every once in a while. Maybe in normal mode you can get away with that approach, but I would say even in normal mode, you just kill everything on enemy phase. Just position a little bit better, and you'll get more damage output overall than if you're just trying to train your Dancer. I'm not saying you cannot play the game that way, I'm not saying you can't. It doesn't work at all. I just think it's not optimal, and I think you could do better than that overall. It's not the most efficient way of going about it. Doesn't mean it doesn't work at all. I just think you're making things harder on yourself than it needs to be. But that's the beauty about Fire Emblem. You can play every single way you want. It'll probably work out in some way. I just don't think it's advisable to new players or more advanced players. So that's where I stand on using your Dancer as a combat unit and then like getting them combat every once in a while. Sword Avoid plus 20 in itself, it sounds pretty good. I went over this with dodge tank von higher, but I think generally dodge tanking is not the best way to go about making a broken combat unit. I think you have better options to make a character broken. I'm not going to repeat myself too much on that because I went over it the last couple times. But you can get more mileage out of your army when you have a Dancer compared to plus 20. I'm pretty sure that's always going to be the case. You can make a giant-ass dodge tank. I think you can also just make a good dodge tank without Sword Avoid plus 20, to be honest. You have enough avoid skills to reach like 0 hit. Well, maybe not 0 hit, but like low enough hit rates to where it's reliable in combination with a bit of extra bulk. Because you got alert stance, you got your prowess avoid, whatever. You have battalions that give you avoid. I think between those you can get sufficient avoid to where a unit is not going to die on enemy phase. Like I remember, for example, in Zoran's Golden Deer run, his Dancer was Marianne, but his Petra was dodging everything. He's like even facing 0 hit. At some points he was like attacking with Petra on player phase because otherwise the enemies wouldn't be able to hit her at all and would just refuse to attack her. There was something like that. So my point here is you don't need Sword Avoid plus 24 dodge tank, so why even bother? So yeah, I disagree. And also dancing good. Don't ditch your Dancer. Never ditch your Dancer for Sword Avoid plus 20. Doesn't mean it doesn't work at all. I just think you're shooting yourself in the foot. Which, you know, you don't want to shoot your Dancer in the foot because then they can't dance anymore. So yeah, there you have it. On some level, I disagree with every one of these. Obviously, the yellow ones are more like, okay, whatever. If you want to do that, you want to do that. I don't have enough experience to discount Wyvern versus Dark Knight Annette. I've seen good players go both ways. Light One Byleth, I said I could see it working. It's not the absolute best class, that's just Wyvern, but it's probably below that just based on like how little you need to get a Light 1. Routing every part 2 map, this is not something you can disagree with. Like if you want to play that way, play that way. It's just not the way you have to play. Like you don't have to route every part 2 map. Just Wyvern spam, I disagree with that one pretty heavily, but the class is really, really good. So in some level I agree, but there you need more support to make your Wyverns the absolute best they can be. Great Dimitri, kind of like Byleth, not his best class ever, but it's like slightly below that because low investments and Wyvern, if you like, it's probably the top 5, top 3 best classes for Dimitri, so whatever. And then Wodao plus one of the best weapons in the game. I disagree that it's like the best weapon or ever or anything, but it's probably top in the upper half of good weapons, so that's why they're yellow. Everything else I firmly or slightly disagree with. So there's my takes. Let me know what yours are, and I know you like these videos because the views have been good, so I'll probably make something more like this in the future once I come up with a better idea, or a good idea in general. So yeah, see ya, bye.